Today, most things when it comes to policy, new ideas moving forward are zero-sum games. What if the game wasn't zero-sum? What if the game was, we'll all benefit some and we all won't get everything we want?
What if the two-party political game we've all grown up with isn't just outdated, but fundamentally incompatible with the challenges of this century? I'm Greg Ammerfell, and on this episode of Pacific Time, we're talking with Robbie Bach, former Microsoft executive and now civic innovator, about what happens when a systems thinker from tech, someone well-versed at creating immersive worlds, applies these sensibilities to imagining the next version of our democracy. Robbie led the Xbox division at Microsoft. These days, he's writing, speaking, and mentoring leaders in the nonprofit and public sectors. His letters on LinkedIn are worth reading. He has choice words for Democrats and Republicans. And he's also writing fun fiction, thrillers like The Blockchain Syndicate, that straddle tech and politics. Robbie believes America's political operating system needs a reboot, one that rewards creativity, cooperation, and results instead of partisanship. Together, we explore what a new politics could look like on the West Coast. So let's ask the big question, what if we could reinvent the two-party game entirely? I started by asking Robbie to summarize his recent letters on LinkedIn.
I started about now almost a couple months ago, and I needed to do something, frankly, for my own sanity, which was to write my thoughts, what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing, etc. And so I wrote a letter to my parents, I wrote a letter to my kids, and then I wrote a letter to Democrats and Republicans. And the basic message to Democrats was get your act together because you don't seem to have your act together. And the basic message to Republicans is what happened to the Republican Party and where did it go? You know, in the end of the day, if you're going to get something done in this great country, you have to find the middle 60, 70, 80% of the landscape. And, we're just now navigating the right 20 and the left 20, and that just doesn't work. And that takes leadership to bring that middle ground into play. And right now, unfortunately, I think we have mostly an absence of leadership, frankly, really on both sides.
We're talking today in the immediate aftermath of an election. What's your read on what the election results mean for the things you were saying in your letters?
I think the first and most important thing that it means is that people vote based on their wallets. What's going on in the economy, how they feel about cost of living, how they feel about affordability. And, that message for most people has, the last year plus has not been great on that front. In fact, the last election was about that. People voted for something different and it's gotten arguably worse. And, if there's one thing the Democrats in the races they won had consistently, regardless of whether you were a progressive candidate like in New York or more moderate candidates like in New Jersey or Virginia, they were all talking about affordability. And they're all talking about what people think about the economy. And you can have all kinds of conversations about, is this person electable? Do I like the person? Do I believe in his morals? Do I believe in foreign affairs? What do I think about X, Y, and Z? In the end of the day, people come back and say, do I feel better about where I am now than I was 6, 9, 12 months, 2 years ago? And the answer consistently is right now, no, I don't actually feel better. And so they voted for something else. To me, the important thing is to actually internalize just that lesson. There will be some people who want to internalize the New York lesson that is, way out progressivism works. I think it might work in New York because he was running against two incredibly incompetent candidates. But I don't think that works nationally. The message, Seattle has an election going on, which is indeterminate between a more mainstream candidate and a more progressive candidate. We'll see how that turns out. But the message shouldn't be one or the other. The message should be about the thing that people talked about, which is about my pocketbook and about affordability.
What about in California, where you're talking from today, a different election there with Prop 50 on the ballot and redistricting? What do you take from that result?
If you look at the polls, most people would say this whole redistricting thing is most people dislike what's going on. And I think that's pretty consistent across the country. They believe and understand this is purely a political play. They think the fact that our districts are being carved up for political advantage is bad for democracy. Having said that, I think what happens is people look and say, okay, well, if you're going to do it in Texas, we're going to do it in California. And so there's a little bit of turnabout's fair play. Now, I think one of the things they did in California that was smart is they made it a temporary provision. So this only lasts for a period of time. And I think that helped soften some of the opposition to the redistricting. People sort of say, okay, I get why you're doing this. But the whole redistricting thing is just bad. But it's a weird circumstance. If one side's going to do it in 6 states, you can't just say, oh, well, I'm opposed to that, so I'm not going to do it, and I'm going to lose Congress as a result. It's a really hard political boundary for people to navigate. I think what we saw in California is people said, I don't like this, but I understand the reasons, so I'm going to vote for it.
Yeah, it seemed like it was a discussion about democratic representation and whether or not the country is for that. And that's what it came down to.
Yeah.
Robbie, you were a senior executive at Microsoft and did some pretty amazing things, launching Xbox during your tenure there. How does big tech leadership translate to the public sector?
That's a really complicated topic. It's a great topic, but it's super complicated. Microsoft's actually an interesting case study, honestly, because I think on the one hand, they run one of the largest employee giving campaigns supported by the corporation in the country. They've raised, I don't know what the total is, but it's, billions of dollars for charities that are directed by employees. And the company matches hours worked. There's a big campaign in October. It's an incredible thing. And it's a way for people to feel like their company is somehow helping their community. It's a way for people to feel like their work is connected to their community. I think that's amazing. And at the same time, you see the company deciding that they're going to sponsor building a ballroom connected to the White House, which has nothing to do with anything. You can decide, leave aside the politics of that. It has nothing to do with Microsoft per se, and it really doesn't have anything to do with the community. It's a political thing. And that is pure corporate self-interest. I don't know any other way to call it. And so, and look, I don't mean to call out Microsoft. I could do the same thing at Google. I could do the same thing at Facebook. I could do the same thing at Apple. You can go through the list, Tesla, you can go through the whole list. And they're playing a short-term political game. And their view is that this will blow over at some point, and then we can return to some level of normalcy. But in the meantime, we're going to protect our business interests. I understand that from a shareholder perspective. I don't love it as an attitude, and I think it's probably short-sighted for the corporation long term, because I think it harms employees, and I think people feel less about the work they do. So there is this delicate balance, and companies have to find what's good for their customers, what's good for their citizens, and good for their employees and the communities in which they work. And Microsoft's always been great in the Seattle community. But then they have this balance of what's right for shareholders, and that leads to some very, very difficult choices.
Post Microsoft, you've very consciously made the move toward engaging civically and politically. How does your tech experience inform how you engage in the public?
It's very funny, actually. So I'm on the board at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. I've been on that board for now 20 years. An amazing organization. But inevitably, I end up chairing the tech committee. Because I worked at Microsoft, I'm a technologist. And, the truth is, I'm a product guy, I suppose, but I don't have a deep technical background. My undergraduate degree is in economics, and I have an MBA. So at some level, I do get involved in those organizations purely from a tech perspective. I think the more important way it affects my engagement is about creativity and innovation, and encouraging organizations, nonprofit organizations, many of them, in particular as they get larger, get more conservative in the way they allocate resources, more conservative in the way they think about new initiatives. And, that's too bad. And, Microsoft's a great example of a company that's continued to reinvest itself. Microsoft is 50 years old this year. It's crazy. And it continued to reinvent itself. And, these nonprofit and community organizations have to do that as well. Boys and Girls Clubs of America is like 115 years old. It's been around a long time. And yet they have had to continue to reinvent themselves. And so my job on those boards oftentimes is to encourage them to think more prospectively about what they can do new and do differently.
And do you see similar room for the public sector, for folks in government to take on an innovative mindset?
Well, they have to. I mean, part of the problem we have right now in government is the government is still trying to legislate the social media revolution, and that revolution's, mostly over. That cat got out of the bag and ran away and is hiding someplace in the forest and will never be found again. Meanwhile, AI and all this new tech stuff is spreading, and the government is not on the forefront of thinking about that. Likewise, if you think about things like housing, if you think about immigration, if you think about trade, if you think about healthcare, all these things need innovation. The tacking on a new program that was designed 10 years ago isn't going to work. We have to think about these things in a different way. And until we do that, we're going to continue to struggle and continue to chase instead of getting ahead of the problem.
So let's talk about a couple of those just quickly. Around AI, what kind of role would you like to see government playing?
Well, I think there's a couple of different things. First of all, purely from an application perspective, governments, whether it's local, my Medina City Council, or whether it's the city of Seattle, or whether it's the state of Washington or the federal government, you have to be experimenting with AI as a practical application. You have to be doing the work to actually apply it and figure out how it works. Now, you see examples of this. I mean, TSA is certainly well on the cutting edge of using that and has automated a bunch of different processes. But we need to do more of that. So there's are you using it aspect that to me is incredibly important. Then there's a guardrails aspect to it that is equally important. What are the guardrails of what we deem legal and acceptable in our society as a whole? And government plays a role, maybe not the only role, but plays a role in setting those guardrails. And third, then you have to think about just pure policy. Okay, I'm on the board at an organization called the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we have a working group right now that's working on the future of the American workforce. Okay, well, AI is right in the center of that. And the idea that our government has no strategy for dealing with the impact of AI in the American workforce is kind of a shocking problem, and one that will hurt us for the next 10 years. And we need to be more progressive about thinking about that. So you can look at it at all of those different levels. And, look, the hardest one is the guardrails one, because that requires judgments. And you have people in tech on one side and other people who are more worried about the future of what AI could mean to, they'll say to the human race. And finding that middle ground is hard. So that's the one that's the toughest. The experimentation part and the policy stuff should be relatively straightforward. And yet we struggle with all three of those.
Around workforce in particular, I'm curious, do you have ideas on steps that governments could be taking to ensure that we are making a transition into an AI-equipped workforce?
What I will say, the area I'll focus on just as a small example, is how we think about job training and how we think about what our community college systems do, how we think about apprenticeship programs, how we think about retraining employees. If you're going to be in a nimble environment, if you're going to create an economy that is nimble and a workforce that is nimble, you have to be really good at those types of things. And we are uniquely inconsistent. And that's a polite way of saying it. We're uniquely inconsistent at implementing any of that. We have community colleges that want to be 4-year institutions. It's not clear to me. We need more 4-year institutions. That's an interesting transition. And at the same time, we have job training programs that do an excellent job. And how does the government engage with business to understand what do you think you're going to need 5 years from now? And how are we together going to produce a workforce or enable a workforce to be created that meets those needs? And that kind of interaction between the government, nonprofits, and corporations just doesn't happen consistently anywhere near as much as it needs to.
Yeah, and I would expand on that to say there are also a lot of weird perceptions. I mean, this sort of small government ethos, I think we can all appreciate that government isn't always as effective as it could be, but the idea that we're going to go to no government or very little government seems kind of wild and gets in the way of the kinds of dialogue that you're describing in between government and the public sector.
Well, I think the middle ground here is don't look to government to solve the problem, but government must participate. And that's the unique place you have to end up. if you say, oh, the government's going to solve this problem, that is a slow boat to no solution, because government by itself rarely solves problems and certainly doesn't move quick enough in the world we live in. But government working with the private sector, working with nonprofits and civic organizations, that triad can actually do incredible work, and particularly at the state and local level, where there are unique needs, unique opportunities given the workforce in a particular location, to pick an example. And if you can get the government with local industry and local nonprofits to work together, you can do transformative things. And we've seen examples of that.
Robbie, do examples of transformation like that come to mind? Have you seen things that have warmed your heart?
Well, this is an old example, but it's one I know reasonably well. The city of Milwaukee went through it was on a different problem, and their problem was on teen pregnancy. So it's a completely non sequitur from the job training thing we're discussing. But they put the government together with local business and together with local nonprofits, and it had a dramatic impact on what was going on in the lives of their young people. And, that's a powerful thing. Now, there have been, nonprofits have been working on that problem for a long time. Governments have been trying to figure out what role to play. Industry cares because it affects their workforce, and it affects the economy, and affects their ability to get things done. You can do really powerful things when that happens. And, it's not easy. You got three sectors trying together. You got a lot of different leaders with a lot of different interests. But I do think that's where the power lies.
It is in that collaboration across sectors.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Let's shift gears a bit. You're mentioning an example in the Midwest. I want to talk about here at home on the West Coast. You're from the Southeast originally, correct?
Well, I'm a little bit from all over. I'm a little bit of a polyglot. I grew up in the Midwest. So my formative years from age 4 to age 12 or 13 was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I moved to North Carolina in 8th grade. My family, the rest of my siblings and family eventually migrated there as well. And so most of my family's now in North Carolina. And then I left for the left coast when I was 23 years old. So a long time ago, 40 some years ago. Went to California and then ultimately settled in Washington. So I have a little bit of, and my wife is Dutch. So she's born in the Netherlands. So we have a deep connection to Europe. So admittedly, we're a little bit of a polyglot.
So you have a truly national and global perspective, and I would say even in your time based in the Northwest and Microsoft, I'm guessing your work took you all over the world. How do those experiences shape your civic imagination?
I'll say this in the most open way. What I believe is this country is a great place. It's an amazing country. It has tremendous resources, really imaginative, creative people, great diversity, and I mean that in the broadest sense, which I think is really powerful. Having said that, we don't have every solution. We have some solutions in the places where we're, remarkably innovative. But, I go to the Netherlands, which is essentially a second country for me. I spend a lot of time there. The transportation system in Amsterdam is amazing. And it's a little unique. It's flat, so bikes are a huge part of what they do. But you have a great metro system. You have a great above ground rail system. You've got a bike network that just kind of blows your mind. And actually not that many cars. It's super interesting. So they have a very interesting approach to thinking about how to take a country that is very tiny, but has a lot of people, and enabling incredible mobility without completely clogging up the world with cars. It's fascinating. Hard to replicate in some parts of the US, so fine. But there's things we can learn from that. And I just think people struggle having two ideas in their head at the same time. People struggle saying America's a great place, and then they can't say, but there's ways we can learn. And I just think that's a shame. I think both statements can and are true. And we have to learn from that.
Let's bring it home to the West Coast. How do you see the West Coast compared to other parts of the country and some of these other places in the world that you're deeply familiar with?
It's interesting. On the one hand, people say, well, the West Coast is so liberal. And the truth is, maybe by population, that's true. But the West Coast is no different than any other part of the country. If you go to Eastern Washington, it's actually remarkably conservative. If you go to Northern California outside of San Francisco, it's remarkably conservative. If you go to Eastern Oregon wants to be part of Idaho, right? So there's more diversity in the West Coast than people give it credit for. The population centers itself tend to be more liberal and more progressive. So that's a unique thing. But even in the state of California, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, LA, nothing alike. Like really very different cultures, very different politics, very different approaches to how to think about problem solving. So on one hand, the West Coast is no different than the rest of the country in that respect. On the other hand, because there's less, I'll say this carefully, Western history on the West Coast, because the West Coast is newer to the population of people who moved west from the East Coast, there is a different sense of tradition on the East Coast than the West Coast. The East Coast has deep sets of traditions and history. And, you go to Boston, parts of Boston are amazingly old and amazingly incredible that way. Where I live in Seattle, it just doesn't have that, right? I mean, in the 1700s, Seattle was, native population everywhere. That's a completely different thing. And that does affect the way people think about history. It does affect the way people think about their culture and what they do. And then the third thing I'll say is immigration patterns matter a lot. I grew up in the Midwest. There's a heavy level of immigration where I grew up, from the Nordic countries, from Germany, from Ireland. That forms a cultural base in that part of the world that's different than the cultural base where I grew up in Seattle, which has a lot of Japanese immigration, a lot of Southeast Asian immigration, Chinese immigration, in addition to people who literally came across the country. And as a good Washingtonian, I would be complete if I did say immigration from California, because there's a lot of Californians that have come north as well. So that affects the culture where we are. And so you do get these similarities and differences that are what makes America beautiful.
Do you think there's something special about the West Coast compared to other places?
Oh, sure. I love the openness to new ideas, the curiosity on the West Coast that I think is kind of infectious. I think the amount of open land and the natural beauty of where we live. I mean, in Seattle, there's 3 incredible national parks within 2 hours of my house. I can disappear in the mountains. And if I'm not careful, literally disappear into the mountains, quite easily. If I go back to the East Coast, that's obviously a little bit tougher. Having said that, I can wax eloquently about the beauty of Midwestern values and growing up on the north side of Milwaukee and how that shaped me. And when I go back there, those people are still the way they were, and they're still as lovely as they were when I was there. And I still sort of reflect fondly on that. I go to the South, where I also grew up, and, there's a different sense of hospitality there than you get elsewhere. Mix and match. It's the nature of the way the country works, and you try to find the best of everything you can.
Yeah. So I think you're talking about things that make this region special, but also ways that the exceptionalism isn't so exceptional, that every place has something unique.
Like Seattle, as an example, Seattle drives me a little crazy sometimes. Like the community politics in Seattle are, just hard to, I've been there for 35 years. I don't understand it. There's this sort of always doing something different, not particularly because we think that's good, but because it's different. There's just kind of a nature. Portland's the same way. It is idiosyncratic in its Portlandia culture, and so not good or bad, but boy, different, and you kind of have to adapt to that. And I suppose every place has a little bit of that.
Let's shift gears again. Talk about reimagining citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen in an age of distrust and digital disengagement?
Well, I think the biggest thing it means to be a citizen is exactly what you just said without the dis. People have to be engaged. And I'm not too fussy about how you're engaged, honestly. If you're engaged in your church, if you're engaged in your government, if you're engaged in a nonprofit, or you're engaged in your corporation, you're engaged in your country club, if you're engaged in your book club, whatever it is, I really want people to be more engaged, more challenging, seek out fact, seek out truth, seek out opinions, listen with respect to people who disagree with you. And that doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but it means you can have a conversation with them. It's that engagement that, and I'll blame social media for this, but there's more than that going on, but it's that disengagement and that anonymity that has allowed us to separate ourselves. And I think that's a shame. And I think it affects so many things that are going on.
How can individuals and companies, because you've got that corporate perspective, how can individuals and companies lead systematic change?
Well, I think everybody has to think about it for their own talents and sensibilities. If you're a tech company, that gives you a certain lens and a certain painting area to draw on and to affect people and impact people. If you're a company like Costco, also a Seattle company, or Amazon, another Seattle company, you see literally billions of transactions all the time. That means you have hundreds of millions of customers. You have millions of employees. So you have your own sort of little unique way of impacting things. I'm a co-owner of a gluten-free pasta company called Manini's in Kent, Washington. Well, we employ 25 or 30 people. I love the fact that we impact those people's lives. And that even though that business is still growing and still trying to make its way as a business, we have a great product. We're expanding, and those people are gainfully employed. And that, I think about myself, I won't resist to do this, but I've chosen to be a writer. And so I went from being a tech manager and leader to being an author. And so I have things like the Blockchain Syndicate and my book, The Wilkes Insurrection, which are fiction novels, but talk about everything you and I have just discussed and are really designed to be a fun way. I want people to read those books, and when they get to the end, say, God, that was a great thriller. I couldn't put it down. And then I want them to, I love this character, Tamika Smith, and this guy, Bryce Roskovich, and blah, blah, blah. And then I want them to pause and say, oh, wait, that made me think too. And so each of us has to find that way of engaging. For a bunch of people I work with at Boys and Girls Club, it's about the kids. And it's about spending time with those kids. And, 20 minutes with a child in a gym is, a month's worth of work. And I get that.
Yeah, for sure. You kind of reference this with the tech companies that are supporting the construction of the White House ballroom. Another visual that's been running quite often is of the tech executives, the billionaires or oligarchs, if you choose to use that term, sitting around a White House roundtable offering praise for the president. What's your read on that situation? I mean, you mentioned the sort of short-term politics they're playing, but on one hand, I'd love your reaction to that scene, but also whether you think there's more that leaders at Microsoft, Facebook, Apple could be doing to affect positive social, political, cultural change in this moment.
Well, look, let's talk about basics first. Going to have a roundtable with the president, if you're a CEO and you get invited, not a bad thing to do. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, the president is a kind of an important person in the United States, regardless of who's in office. So the idea that a CEO would say, hey, I've been invited by the president to participate in a roundtable, I'm going to go do it. That in and of itself doesn't bother me at all. Now, what you say at that roundtable and what feedback you provide to the president, that's a very important distinction. And in my mind, most of these meetings have been perfunctory and not about trying to influence the president in any particular way, but about doing what you have to do to keep your government contracts and to keep your government business going and to keep the government out of your business's hair. And so I don't object to the meetings at all. I think they are an opportunity, and I think mostly, hard for me to tell, I haven't been in all the meetings, or I haven't been in any of the meetings, frankly, but they don't look like they're an opportunity that's been taken advantage of. They look like opportunity missed to me. Now, the flip side to that is if you go to that meeting, it's fine. And whether you're a Trump supporter or not, you go to the meeting, fine. But there are other things you can continue to do in your community. And depending on the tech company, some of them have done a lot. Some of them have done very little. I only know one really well, and that's Microsoft. And Microsoft's incredibly engaged in its community. Super engaged in the state of Washington, super engaged in what's going on in the Puget Sound, and respected for what they do there. Amazon, I think, probably has a little bit of a different reputation. I don't know if that's earned or not, because I'm not in meetings. You go down in the Valley, some Valley companies, I think, are pretty engaged in their local communities. I think some less so. Google has a reputation of doing a lot of, giving in the community. I don't know about Meta or Apple, but I think it's inconsistent, and I think that's too bad. So to me, if you're a CEO, this is about balance. Look, if I'm going to go participate in a White House meeting because it's the president of the United States and there's an opportunity for me to have influence on what's going on, I should go do that. But I should also be doing the flip side of that, which is speaking out when I think things aren't right and taking advantage of working in my own communities and the communities where my employees work. Finding that balance is a tricky job. It's why the jobs those people are in are really complicated, challenging jobs.
Is there any one business leader you look at and say that person is doing a fantastic job of balancing the sort of political, social, cultural, and commercial responsibility?
The only one I'll highlight, and it's not a particular leader, but it's a corporation, which is Costco. And it's only because I know a few of the people on the board, and I know people who started that company, and I know where their focus is. And, Costco will tell you, we care about our partners who are our suppliers. We care deeply about our employees, and they play their employees incredibly well with great benefits and have incredible loyalty among their employees. We serve our customers, and so they try to do the right thing for their customers. And they're disciplined about it. And they're incredibly involved in education. So they have done a ton of work in the education space. The original founders have now all transitioned out of the company, and the company has continued their work, which I think speaks deeply to how embedded it is in the culture of Costco. And I think that's just a powerful example. And again, I've not worked there. I'm a customer. I've not worked there, but I know the story reasonably well because it's in Seattle, because I know a few of the people personally. And I think it's a powerful example of a company that has stayed its course and resisted outside forces from changing it from the things it believes in. And yet, certainly engages in what's going on in the community around it.
Yeah, they seem to have taken stances that oppose policies of the Trump administration, for example, because they believe that that's in keeping with their support for employees and partners, right?
Right, exactly. And to be fair, they probably don't have a huge number of government contracts, so it may not be as difficult a choice for them. Nevertheless, they can be regulated just like any other company, and they choose to take a path that's consistent with what they've always believed.
You highlighted the example of your books. I mean, you're an imaginative guy. Your career was in creating the Xbox platform and kind of the world building, as it's called, that happens within the games on Xbox. What are your lessons from that, and how do they apply to the work we're talking about of civic engagement and nation building?
So much of what you discover in writing and producing something like Halo, which I should be clear, had very little to do with other than approving the purchase of the company. So, but so much of what you're doing there is about the nature of the people themselves. So Halo has characters. Master Chief is a person. He's a personality. Cortana is a personality. If I think in my own books, Tamika Smith, Bryce Roscovich, Gerald Jessup, these are all people who have sensibilities and personalities and cultures and strengths and weaknesses and blind spots. And so much of creating those worlds and making them real is the idea that nothing's perfect. And the idea that there are trade-offs that have to be made, choices that have to be made, and people have strengths and weaknesses, and how they survive and progress is based on how they apply those strengths and weaknesses and how they deal with them. And so for me, the way that applies to the rest of the world and the way it applies in my stories is you see those things coming out in the issues we have in our country. I mean, one of the biggest challenges we have is we struggle making choices, and we struggle understanding that people have strengths and weaknesses, and we aren't good yet, or not fully good, I'd say, at deciding a direction to go. So that's difficult, but it is, again, all about the people. So when you go to vote, you're voting not just for a party. In fact, I think mostly you should not be voting for a party. What you should be voting for is the personality of that person. Do you like their strengths and weaknesses? Do you think they're a good leader? Do you think their ideas are the right ideas? That doesn't happen as much as it should. In fact, I think it happens remarkably less than it should now, more than ever.
Well, and I'd also say that when you sit down to write a book, or when a set of game developers think about a world like Halo, they've got a vision for that world. Do you see vision in the civic world, in the political world?
I do. And I think there's a path forward to a better day, let's say it that way. So when I'm writing in Wilkes Insurrection or the Blockchain Syndicate, or I'm writing my letters on LinkedIn, I'm writing with a purpose that wants us to end up in a better place. And I think, in many respects, America has a unique set of attributes that can enable us to get there. Incredible human capital. Our diversity is our strength. We have amazing resources, a system of government that is complicated and frustrating, but which when it's applied well, can really work. And we have a scale that most countries just don't have. Those are powerful attributes. And so when I'm writing, ultimately I'm writing to get to a better place. Now, the challenge I have is in Wilkes Insurrection, the Blockchain Syndicate, we're clearly not there yet. And so things don't end up shiny and rosy. There's more writing for me to do. Likewise, in my letters, the letters on LinkedIn aren't shiny and rosy. They are thoughts, and they are a pathway to get to a better place.
Yeah, nobody wants to play a game where the ending is cut and dry and we can tie a bow around it, right?
Well, no, and life doesn't work that way. It's just not that simple. The heroine or the hero may survive, but that doesn't mean they've solved the world's problems. The question is, how do we get to that other side?
Let's talk about this in your writing. When you sit down to write a book and you're thinking about your reader, how do you balance leading them toward a certain place versus letting their imaginations work?
You have to start with imagination. My number one priority is for people to say, wow, that was an incredible roller coaster story ride. I want them to get to they just can't put it down. And, my chapters are relatively short. I want them to get to an end of the chapter with a little bit of a cliffhanger and say, I got to read the next chapter. And then I want them to keep going. If you're not dedicated to that craft, the rest doesn't work because people won't read the book. Because they are reading fiction for a reason. And they're reading a thriller for a reason. And they want to be thrilled. They want to go on a roller coaster ride. They want to have an adventure. And they want to feel like they're in the character of your hero or heroine and experience what they're experiencing. And so that's, my primary focus, no question. My second focus is the writing itself. It's easy to write a thriller that's not actually that well written. And writing dialogue that is predictable or not very lifelike happens all the time. In thrillers that are actually well read and that people enjoy. But for me, I want to be a good writer just for the writing's sake. And so that's my second thing is, what's the quality of writing? I think the quality of writing in the Wilkes Insurrection is really good. And I think in the Blockchain Syndicate, it's even better. And you progress. And then only when I have those two things and I feel comfortable with those two things, do I think about, okay, what's the message I'm delivering? And how does that fit into the storyline? And how does that fit into the thoughts of my lead character, Tamika Smith? And so it affects plot, it affects the storyline, it affects the way she's thinking about things. But the minute it gets in the way of the story itself, then I've gone off the rails a little bit. I got to bring myself back. And that's hard because I have real ideas and it's hard to stay true to the story all the way through the end. And I think I've navigated that well in both books, but that's subject to reader review.
So take this idea of a propulsive plot. What are the plot lines, if you think forward about American history ahead, that you see emerging? What are the plot lines that are going to drive us as a country in the next 50 years?
For better or for worse, the last line in the Blockchain Syndicate, this isn't giving anything away. The last line in the Blockchain Syndicate is things will probably get worse before they get better. And sadly, I think that's probably true. American history is filled with what I'll call convulsive moments where we get to the other side and it's not without harm and danger and challenge. But those convulsive moments get us to a next level. And, you can highlight, lots of these. You can think about, even in the last 100 years, you can think about the crash in 1929. You could think about the Great Depression. You can think about World War II. You can think about the dropping of the atomic bomb. Those are convulsive moments that changed the next 100 years of history and actually propelled America into a different role in the world. Go forward to the 60s, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, marches, Watts burning, cities under curfew. It was a convulsive time for the country. Protests against the Vietnam War. It's a coming of age moment for the country and a reckoning with what we think about. And the next 30 years, thankfully for me, the big chunk of my lifetime, benefited from that convulsive set of moments. And I think we're in the midst of that again. I'll have to put my creativity hat to figure out how I view the convulsive moments to come. But we're in the midst of those right now.
Well, and I was going to ask, what are the convulsions you're watching for ahead of us, Robbie?
I think we're at an economic crossroads. That theme certainly goes through the blockchain syndicate. And figuring out, between the debt, how our economy works, the dollar's role in the world economy, now all this tariff stuff. I mean, that's really complicated, and I think ripe for change. I think human migration is a huge issue right now. And I don't say that, that's an immigration issue in the United States, but it's not just in the US. This is a problem in Europe. It's a challenge in the Middle East. Africa is a bit of a tinderbox on this front. There is a movement for people to say, hey, I want to go someplace else. And I want to be someplace else because I perceive that it's better there. How we respond to that, how we deal with that, and the repercussions of that, I think are incredibly important. And so I think that's an interesting thing. We have a series of wars going on that have implications for the future. What's going on in the Middle East and continues to go on in the Middle East, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in North Africa. And these are really challenging things. Now, we've sort of kept a lid on it in a way, in a regionalist way, but who knows how that will play out going forward. And then I will just say, in the US at least, and I think this is true in a number of other countries, the struggle between progressivism and recidivism is a hard problem. And how we get into a mode of moving forward while bringing some of our history with us, but bringing new things in, that's a real challenge. And figuring out how that's going to happen and how we prevent a cultural war, even if we don't have a physical war.
So we can anticipate convulsions, but as you say, the convulsions tend to precede a better world. What kind of better world might emerge from the sort of disruption that is possible to see coming?
Well, I think there's a number of places where the world can be a better place. We have one of the other convulsions I should have mentioned is around energy and the environment. There's a world where we figure out how to supply the energy that feeds our population going forward. And I use the word feeds in both a literal and a figurative sense. If the world population is going to continue to grow, if we're going to continue to increase the standard of living for people across the world, we're going to need a lot more energy. And we have to figure that out. But a world in which we have, a supply of energy that is safe, secure, and environmentally friendly, that's an incredibly positive development. Are we there? No. Do I have an answer for you today? No. Do I think there's a bunch of people who are working on it and I think there are answers out there? Yeah, I do. So that's a specific example of a better place. I think we could also find a world in which, and this is maybe a little bit optimistic given what's going on in the country right now, but a world in which we think of our differences as a powerful opportunity, to me, is a big deal. The U.S. has always been a country of diversity and immigration and cultural melange. And the idea that we're somehow going to get rid of that is, to me, kind of crazy. At the same time, change is uncomfortable for people. So how do we get to the other side where people are able to accept that they can bring what is theirs along with them and not feel like that's threatened. And at the same time, recognize that new things are valuable, and people with different points of view and people who come from different cultures are incredibly valuable for us even just from a human capital perspective. That to me is a real opportunity. Again, if I had a magic 8 ball to predict how those solutions work out, that would be great. I do think some of it depends on what causes the convulsion. That's an indeterminate thing right now. I think there's a lot of candidates for change.
You've highlighted a number of things that are relevant to this question, both in mentioning it early on, the sort of 20% at either side, kind of the far left and the far right, with the middle kind of being, up for grabs. The fact that the sort of extremism exists, not just in the US, but lots of parts of the world. Obviously, one thesis I've been exploring is that those divisions are somewhat reflected geographically, and that the West Coast might consider stronger assertions of its autonomy around a shared set of values, which is not to diminish the differences of opinion that exist on the West Coast. Are West Coast states and other places facing federal hostility and withdrawal, are they right to pursue these notions of kind of soft secession?
Look, I think that is, this is a personal opinion. I think that's fraught with problems. First of all, because as we said, even within the West Coast, the minute you say, well, we're going to soft secede, then Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, and Northern California want to soft secede too, right? Which has huge implications for all kinds of different things. The idea that you could soft secede, I'll say it strongly, I think is a little misguided. Now, having said that, are there ways in which Oregon, Washington, California can form a coalition around certain things and provide leadership on new ideas? The answer to that's absolutely yes. Right? Think about the energy thing that we just discussed. Could those economies take the leadership in thinking about new forms of energy? The state of Washington already gets a ton of its energy from renewable resources. Could we do more? Could we work with California, Oregon, and I'll say Nevada and Idaho just to bring in some cultural diversity? Could we together come forward in that space and show a way that things could be done differently? And I think the answer is yes. I'm an inclusionist. So I think of it less as succeeding and more as coalescing and providing leadership. And I think that's a important distinction. And can the West Coast provide leadership? Yes. Do I think there's things where the Midwest or the East could provide leadership on? The answer is absolutely yes. Again, seems to be, for lack of a better phrase, a little more innovation on the West Coast. And so maybe that means we have a broader role to play.
Let me bring it back into your corporate experience. When were there times where acting as a big unified whole was advantageous versus, kind of empowering an upstart team to run off and do something exciting or risky?
You always, I'll give you the perfect example. Microsoft Office. So when I joined the Microsoft Office team in 1992, the two powerhouses were Word and Excel. And there was PowerPoint, which is down in California, sort of separate, but Word and Excel were the leading applications we had, and they were going to drive us to success. And it became quickly clear that those innovative, independent teams were doing great work. Word, in particular on Windows, Excel on Windows and the Mac, Word on the Mac. The graphical versions of those products were great products and leading products. And yet, the transition to Microsoft being the leader in the application space happened in large part because the Word and Excel team got together. They pulled the PowerPoint team with them. They ultimately pulled the Access team with us, which people forget about. There ultimately was an Outlook team, which nobody forgets about. And that became Microsoft Office. And that collective group was a big group. It took that collective action to drive change in the industry. And here's the reason why. Enterprises decided they weren't going to buy individual applications because they wanted them to work together. And the IT director said, well, look, we're going to use our weight to get one good deal on a suite of applications, not 4 mediocre deals on things that don't work together. And who has leading applications in word processing and spreadsheets who can provide one really good deal for us? Microsoft. And the Salesforce was the easier product to sell. Salesforce liked that. We had these agreements that were enterprise-wide agreements. So you could license your company with a suite of applications that were leaders in their individual areas and that work together, and you could do it under one contract that IT could control. That's a powerful thing.
So you're deploying the metaphor of standalone applications and all the specialization that they incorporate, and a bundle which delivers value across a collected set of apps. So now retranslate that metaphor to the operations of our country.
Well, it's actually, I hadn't really thought about it this way, but we run a federalist organization. The country is it's a federation of states. Take education as an example. The quality of education in a variety of different states varies widely and wildly. And that's because different states have produced different strategies. Well, maybe some of the states that are lagging could go look at some states that are making great progress and say, well, how are you making great progress? What is it that you're doing? And let's spread that to those states. I talked about the VPC and this working group on human capital. A lot of that is about education. And many of the recommendations they will have will center around the fact of taking the best ideas from various locations and applying them in a broad-scaled way. I mean, it is the beauty of our diversity. We can experiment 50 times, and we can discover that 15 of those experiments are working, 15 of them are failing, and a bunch are in the middle. Well, let's pick the 15 that are working. Let's expand on the ones that are in the middle, and let's help the places that aren't progressing as quickly. It's a powerful way to drive change. And it's a way in which we can, most other countries don't have that luxury. In the Netherlands, it's hard to experiment in one region. The country's just too small. And so things work in a different way.
So, Robbie, this is a show that asks what if questions. What are your what if questions about the West Coast and the country?
My first what if question is, what if people would just pause for a moment and talk to everybody else? What if we could decide to have engaging dialogue again? And we could decide that winning was a two-way street, not a one-way street. Now, I happen to think all of that is true, but it's certainly a what if in the country today. Today, most things when it comes to policy, new ideas moving forward are zero-sum games. What if the game wasn't zero-sum? What if the game was, we'll all benefit some and we all won't get everything we want? Because that's unlikely in any event. That would change things in a dramatically different way. What if people recognize they have their own personal obligations, they have their life to lead, they got to raise their kids, all those kinds of things, but decided they were going to dedicate a little bit of their time in whatever way they could to their local community. Some aspect, their school, a local club, a Boys and Girls Club. I'll just pitch that. A Habitat for Humanity, near and dear to my heart. Some way in which they took a little bit of their time. George Bush said 1,000 points of light, and he wasn't wrong about that. Now, I don't know that we need 10,000 charities, but 1,000 points of light is, 350 million people deciding that they're spending a little bit of their time helping somebody else. And again, I know that sounds incredibly romantic and incredibly naive, but that's where the power of change really is the things people do every day to help somebody who needs a little bit of help. And by the way, it would help you see the other side of the coin in a different way, and would help on my first what if, which is how do we engage with other people who we don't necessarily agree with.
What struck me in this conversation with Robbie Bach is how practical his vision is. He isn't saying burn it all down, he's saying debug it. The two-party system won't reform itself, but people and regions that value innovation can. That's why the West Coast matters. We prototype what others later adopt. Maybe democracy needs what tech calls a beta test. Open primaries, ranked choice voting, new coalitions built around shared outcomes instead of party labels, and the horse race of elections. As Robbie reminds us, political reform isn't about perfect code, it's about persistent iteration. So what if every citizen saw themselves as a civic designer? What's one feature you would rewrite in the American political operating system? If today's episode made you think, please follow Pacific Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Substack and watch us on YouTube and share it with a friend who's ready to help reinvent the game.